The bread was already toasted, golden brown, slightly darker at the edges, still sitting on the white ceramic plate on the kitchen table, exactly where Ethan Parker had left it. No bite taken. In Hutchinson, Kansas, a town of just over 40,000 people, mornings in March usually pass without incident. Clear skies, a light spring breeze rolling in from wheat fields. The kind of morning where nothing ever happens. March 12, 2009 began that way. At 7:30 a.m., Ethan Parker stepped out of the red brick house on Plum Street. He was 15 years old. His backpack hung loose on one shoulder, the zipper half open, a math textbook visible inside. He wore a dark hoodie, worn sneakers, and jeans his mother had already reminded him were too thin for early spring. He shut the door behind him. Inside the house, the toaster clicked off seconds later. Ethan didn't hear it. At 7:45 a.m., Dorothy, a retired nurse who had lived across the street for nearly 3 decades, glanced up from her kitchen sink and saw Ethan pass by her window. He walked the same route he always did, heading toward a road that curved past Cary Park. She waved. He nodded back. Nothing unusual. That was the last confirmed sighting of Ethan Parker. By 8:15 a.m., at Hutchinson High School, the bell rang. Students settled into their seats. Attendance was taken. Ethan's seat was empty. At first, no one panicked. Teenagers oversleep. They skipped. They missed buses. Teachers marked him absent and moved on. But by 9:30 a.m., when Ethan still hadn't shown up, the office called home. No answer. By lunchtime, concern had replaced routine. And by sunset, Hutchinson was facing a question that would echo for years. How does a 15-year-old vanish in less than 45 minutes, without a struggle, without witnesses, and without a single sign of foul play? Police would later describe that morning as uneventful. Too uneventful. No screams reported. No abandoned backpack. No torn clothing. No blood. No signs of a fight. Ethan had simply stopped existing between Plum Street and Hutchinson High. Authorities initially believed what most people wanted to believe, that Ethan ran away. It fit the statistics. It fit the comfort narrative. But it did not fit the evidence. Because Ethan Parker left behind things runaways don't. His phone charger was still plugged into the wall. His bike was still chained in the garage. His savings jar, nearly $200 in cash, untouched on his dresser. And that untouched slice of toast, a detail so small, so ordinary, it felt almost cruel. Search teams flooded Cary Park that afternoon. Dogs tracked his scent for several blocks and then lost it abruptly near a service road that bordered the park's edge. As if Ethan had simply stepped into thin air, detectives canvassed the neighborhood. Dorothy repeated what she'd seen. Ethan walking alone, calm, unhurried. No suspicious vehicles reported. No unfamiliar faces. By nightfall, police quietly shifted their language. Not missing, possibly voluntarily absent. The community heard it and felt the relief, because if no one took him, then nothing truly terrible had happened. At least, not yet. What no one realized that day, not the police, not the teachers, not even Ethan's family, was that the most important clues were already being overlooked. A timestamp that didn't align, a witness statement that sounded too rehearsed, and a person who would later describe themselves as helpful, concerned, and close to the family. At the time, they were trusted. They always are. And for the next several years, Hutchinson would slowly fall silent as posters faded, leads dried up, and hope began to rot quietly beneath the surface. The case would go cold. But the truth did not disappear. It waited. By the morning of March 13th, Hutchinson no longer felt ordinary. Patrol cars idled at intersections they had never needed to watch before. Flyers bearing Ethan Parker's face were taped to storefront windows, utility poles, the glass doors of the public library. His school photo, slightly crooked smile, hair not quite behaving. Stare back at a town that suddenly realized how small it was. The first 72 hours after a disappearance are supposed to be decisive. That's what the manuals say. That's what investigators believe. It is the window where mistakes can still be undone, where evidence is fresh, where people remember details they will later forget or reshape. In Ethan's case, those hours slipped away quietly. Police retraced his walk from Plum Street to Hutchinson High. The sidewalk showed no scuffs, no disturbed gravel, no dropped items. Cary Park was searched again, this time more thoroughly. Officers waded the shallow creek near the service road, their boots sinking into soft mud. Nothing surfaced. No shoe, no fabric, no sign that a teenager had ever passed through that space. The search dogs were brought back out. Once again, they followed Ethan's scent from the front steps of his home, along the sidewalk, past Dorothy's house, toward Cary Park. And once again, they stopped at the same spot near the service road, confused, circling, whining softly. To the handlers, it suggested one thing. Ethan had gotten into a vehicle, but no one reported seeing one. At the Parker home, time stalled. Ethan's mother sat at the kitchen table, staring at the toast that had never been eaten. By now, it had gone cold and hard, but she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. It felt like erasing proof that the morning had been real. Detectives asked routine questions. Had Ethan been acting differently? Any trouble at school? Problems with friends? A girl? The answers were all the same. No, no, no. He had been planning for the future, talking about driving lessons, asking about summer jobs, complaining about homework, normal teenage things. Still, the questions kept circling back to one assumption. Run away. It was never said directly at first. It didn't have to be. The tone shifted. The urgency softened. The search radius expanded in the wrong direction, outward instead of inward. By the second night, officers quietly stopped treating the park as a crime scene. That decision would matter later. On March 14th, the first inconsistency appeared. It came from a well-meaning volunteer named Mark Reynolds. Mark was a familiar face in Hutchinson, a middle-aged man who helped organize community events, coach youth sports, and often assisted families during crises. He showed up early that morning offering help, telling officers he had driven the area near Cary Park around 7:40 a.m. on the day Ethan vanished. He said he saw Ethan. According to Mark, the boy was standing near the service road, talking to someone in a vehicle, a dark sedan, windows tinted. The driver was male, but Mark couldn't describe him clearly. At the time, the statement felt like a breakthrough. Finally, something concrete. But when detectives asked Mark to clarify his timeline, it shifted subtly but noticeably. First, he said 7:40 a.m., then maybe closer to 7:35. Later, he suggested it could have been after 7:45. Each adjustment was small enough to seem harmless. No one pressed him. That afternoon, police released their first public statement. They emphasized that there were no signs of foul play, that Ethan was likely safe, that runaways often return on their own. It was meant to calm the town. Instead, it planted a danger seed. Tips slowed. Urgency faded. People stopped calling in small details, the unfamiliar car, the odd sound, the moment that didn't quite make sense. Those details disappear first. By the third night, the searches scaled back. Family members walked the park themselves, scanning the ground for anything that didn't belong. Near the edge of the service road, Ethan's aunt noticed something half buried in the dirt, a piece of plastic. It was part of a lunch container, blue, cracked along the side. At first, officers dismissed it. Common litter. Nothing identifiable. But it bothered her. Ethan always packed his lunch. That container would resurface years later. Behind closed doors, detectives reviewed the timeline again. 7:30 a.m., Ethan leaves home. 7:45 a.m., Dorothy sees him pass her window. 8:15 a.m., he's absent at school. Less than 45 minutes. No witnesses. No evidence. No noise. It wasn't impossible, but it wasn't normal either. Still, the case drifted, not cold yet, but cooling. By the end of the third day, one phrase appeared repeatedly in internal notes. No immediate threat detected. Hutchinson wanted to believe that, because accepting anything else meant acknowledging something darker, that a predator could move silently through familiar streets, in broad daylight, and leave nothing behind. And someone somewhere, already knew exactly what had happened to Ethan Parker. They were watching the search. They were listening to the statements. And they were relieved. By the fourth week, the flyers began to curl at the edges. Rain loosened the tape. Wind peeled corners away from poles. Ethan Parker's face slowly disappeared from the town that had once stared at it every day. The official search was over. What remained was paperwork. Detectives stopped knocking on doors and started reviewing binders. Leads were logged, categorized, then quietly dismissed. Without physical evidence, without a body, without a crime scene, the case slipped into an administrative gray zone, not closed, not active, simply waiting. Waiting for what? No one could say. The police continued to use careful language. Ethan was still listed as missing, but internally, the assumption hardened: voluntary disappearance. It explained everything too easily, and that was the problem. At Hutchinson High, Ethan's locker stayed sealed for weeks. Teachers avoided saying his name. Classmates whispered, then stopped whispering altogether. Life pressed forward the way it always does, indifferent to unresolved questions. At home, time fractured. Ethan's room became a museum. His mother vacuumed around his shoes instead of moving them. His father replayed the same mental loop. The morning goodbye, the way Ethan had shrugged his backpack higher on his shoulder, the sound of the door closing. He had been late for work that day. If he had left earlier, would he have seen something? Those thoughts never end. In the absence of answers, the community began to fill the silence. Rumors crept in that Ethan had met someone online, that he had owed money, that he wanted out of a small town that never changed. Each theory shifted responsibility away from the unknown and onto the missing boy himself. It made people more comfortable, and one person, in particular, seemed eager to reinforce that comfort. Mark Reynolds remained present. He checked in on the family, offered rides, organized candlelight vigils, spoke to local reporters with practiced calm, emphasizing how independent Ethan had been, how teenagers sometimes make impulsive choices. He never raised his voice, never appeared suspicious. He was helpful. That's how people describe him. Helpful people are rarely questioned. Behind the scenes, the investigation thinned. The blue lunch container fragment found near the service road was logged, then set aside. No fingerprints. No DNA. It was labeled inconclusive and never tested again. The dog scent trail was debated, then discounted. Dogs make mistakes. Handlers noted. Vehicles passed that road constantly. Witness statements aged poorly. Memories softened. Dorothy, one so confident about the time she saw Ethan, now said she thought it was around 7:45. Could have been earlier. Could have been later. Time erases precision first. Months passed. Then a year. Ethan's case was reassigned twice. Each new detective started at the beginning, then landed in the same place. A thin file and no direction. There were no suspects because there was no crime. That classification mattered more than anyone realized. Because without a crime, there was no urgency, no subpoenas, no warrants, no deep background checks, and no reason to scrutinize people who had inserted themselves early. By 2012, the Parkers were living in two different realities. Publicly, they were encouraged to move on. Privately, they couldn't. Ethan's mother began keeping a notebook. Every phone call, every memory, every small detail that didn't sit right. She wrote about the toast, the lunch container, the shifting timeline in Mark Reynolds' statement. She brought it to police once. They thanked her. Nothing changed. The cold case designation came quietly. No press conference. No announcement. Just a status update in a database. Unsolved. Inactive. In Hutchinson, people stopped asking questions. The disappearance faded into town lore. Something tragic. Something old. Something unresolved but distant. But cold cases don't freeze evenly. Some parts preserve themselves. And somewhere, buried in those early days, was a pattern no one had bothered to map. Not yet. Grief does not arrive all at once. It settles in layers, quietly, like dust in a room no one enters anymore. For the Parker family, The years after Ethan's disappearance were not marked by dramatic breakdowns or public collapses. They were defined by something worse: endurance. Waking up every day and living inside a question that had no edges. Ethan's bedroom stayed untouched long past the point when well-meaning friends suggested otherwise. His mother would stand in the doorway some mornings, hand resting on the frame, listening for sounds she knew would never come. His alarm clock still sat on the nightstand, permanently set to 6:45 a.m. She never turned it off. Birthdays passed. Then holidays. Each one reopened the same wound in a slightly different way. Ethan would have been 16, then 17, then old enough to drive, to graduate, to leave town on his own terms, not vanish into nothing. People stopped asking how the family was doing, not out of cruelty, but discomfort. There is no polite way to discuss unresolved loss. The Parkers learned that silence could be loud. Every few months, a tip would come in: a boy seen in Wichita, a sighting in Oklahoma, someone who looked like Ethan but wasn't. Each call reignited hope, followed by the same slow collapse when nothing panned out. The emotional whiplash was exhausting. Over time, hope itself became dangerous. That's when Ethan's mother stopped waiting for calls and started searching on her own. She revisited the early evidence. The lunch container fragment bothered her more as years passed. She remembered packing his lunch that morning: a sandwich, an apple, and a note she slipped in without thinking: "Have a good day." She realized something she hadn't before. Ethan never ate breakfast at home. He always took it with him. That toast shouldn't have been left behind. It was a small realization, but it cracked something open. She began reconstructing timelines on paper, lining them up with school schedules, bus routes, traffic patterns. She noticed gaps, 10-minute windows that had never been explained, assumptions that had never been verified. One name appeared again and again in the margins: Mark Reynolds. Not as a suspect. Not yet. As a constant. He had been there on day 1, day 2, day 3. He had spoken to police, to reporters, to the family. His version of events was woven into the official narrative. So early it had become fact. But when she compared his statements across years, they didn't line up. The time he claimed to see Ethan shifted. The position of the vehicle changed. Sometimes Ethan was standing, sometimes walking. Details don't usually multiply with memory. They simplify. Meanwhile, the world outside Hutchinson changed. Technology advanced quietly. Databases grew. Records became searchable. DNA analysis improved. Things once considered impossible became routine. Cold cases everywhere were being reopened. But Ethan's file stayed closed until 2018. That year, a new detective joined the department, younger, less connected to the town's shared history. He was assigned to review dormant cases, mostly as an academic exercise. Ethan Parker's name stood out, not because of new evidence, because of the lack of it. The file was thin for a case that had once consumed an entire community. Key items had never been tested. Witness statements were accepted without verification. Early assumptions had hardened into conclusions. It was a case built on comfort, not proof. The detective started at the beginning. That's when he noticed a lunch container fragment had never been analyzed beyond visual inspection, and that the dog scent termination point had never been cross-referenced with vehicle data, and that Mark Reynolds' statements had never been recorded under oath. Small things. But cold cases are broken open by small things. When the detective called Ethan's mother, she didn't cry. She felt something else. Recognition. For the first time in nearly a decade, someone was asking the same question she had been asking herself. The case was reopened quietly. No press release, no announcement, just a file pulled from storage and placed back on a desk. Someone, somewhere, would soon realize that the story Hutchinson had told itself for years was about to change, and that the truth had been waiting patiently, preserved, not lost. By 2018, nearly a decade had passed since Ethan Parker disappeared. Hutchinson had mostly moved on. People didn't talk about him at the grocery store anymore. Teachers mentioned his name in passing, carefully, as if invoking it too loudly could disturb old ghosts. But the detective assigned to the reopened file was not like the others. He had no emotional attachment to the assumptions, no investment in comfort. He only had questions. He began with the fragments of evidence that had never been fully examined. The blue lunch container was first. At a glance, it seemed innocuous, a cracked piece of plastic, half buried near the service road. But in the lab, advanced forensic analysis revealed something new. Fingerprints, faint but present, were recovered along the edge. And the DNA? Not Ethan's. That discovery changed everything. It was subtle, invisible to the casual observer. But it meant someone else had been in contact with Ethan's belongings that morning. Someone not recorded in the initial investigation. Someone who had inserted themselves into the narrative while everyone else slept. The detective revisited witness statements next. Dorothy's observations were rechecked against weather reports, street camera archives, and bus schedules. Nothing contradicted her, but small gaps appeared. A dark sedan, briefly visible in one time-stamped traffic image, could not be tied to anyone in the original report. Then there was Mark Reynolds, the man who had seemed so helpful, so present from day one. The detective noted the shifting details, the time he supposedly saw Ethan, the description of the car, the body language he reported. Inconsistencies that had been minor were now glaring, amplified by the lens of modern investigation. It wasn't overt proof. Not yet, but it was enough to demand a closer look. The detective also examined service records. Cell phone pings, though primitive in 2009, were now cross-referenced with GPS-enabled traffic logs. A single anomaly emerged. Around 7:50 a.m., a car, dark sedan, matching Mark Reynolds' vague description, traveled along Plum Street, deviating from its expected route. It was an innocuous-looking fact at first glance. But combined with the DNA on the lunch container, the dog's lost scent, and the timing inconsistencies, it became troubling. This is how cold cases unravel. Not with a single dramatic discovery, but with a careful stitching together of small, overlooked details that suddenly point in the same direction. By the end of the first week of review, the detective had a theory forming. Someone familiar with Ethan. Someone nearby. Someone who understood the routine so precisely that the disappearance had appeared natural, even ordinary. The harmless figure from Part 1, so helpful, so trusted, was no longer beyond suspicion. Every small detail, every minor inconsistency, became significant. The untasted toast, the untouched savings jar, the fragment of plastic. Each mundane object held a silent story, and together, they began to whisper a truth that Hutchinson had long refused to hear. It wasn't about runaway teenagers. It wasn't about luck or misfortune. It was about choice. And someone had made a decision that morning, calculated and deliberate, in a window less than 45 minutes wide. The detective paused, looking at the timeline spread across the conference room table. He counted minutes, steps, and locations. Each moment was a potential clue, a single chance to see what others had missed. And then he noticed it. The first lie, the one that would crack everything open. Mark Reynolds' statement about seeing Ethan near the service road. It didn't match the traffic data. It didn't match the witness timeline. And it didn't match the evidence on the lunch container. It was small, almost invisible, but it was a lie. And lies, once exposed, have a way of unraveling everything else. The revelation of a lie changes the landscape of an investigation. It transforms familiar paths into unfamiliar terrain, makes allies into potential threats, and forces investigators to question everything they had previously accepted. For the detective reviewing Ethan Parker's case, Mark Reynolds' shifting statements were that seismic fault line. The initial approach was cautious. Reynolds had long been considered a pillar of the community, helpful, approachable, concerned. To accuse him prematurely would not only compromise the investigation, it would shock a town that had grown comfortable with a narrative of benign absence. So the detective began quietly, methodically. He requested that Reynolds return for a formal recorded interview, something that hadn't been done in 2009. This time, the questions were precise, cross-referenced against phone logs, traffic records, and previously overlooked witness accounts. The contradictions emerged quickly. Reynolds insisted he had seen Ethan talking to a man in a dark sedan near the service road at 7:40 a.m. But traffic records, combined with timestamps from surveillance cameras along Plum Street, placed Reynolds' own car miles away at 7:38 a.m. That left barely 2 minutes for him to have seen anything at the service road, an implausible window given distances and walking times. When asked to clarify, Reynolds hesitated. He paused often, his voice measured. I could have been mistaken about the time, he said. It was early. Everything felt jumbled. But the detective pressed further. The lab results from the lunch container fragment had already returned. A single set of fingerprints that did not belong to Ethan. Reynolds' prints were present, not partially smudged or ambiguous. Clear, identifiable. The room went quiet. Mark Reynolds' helpfulness, his constant presence, his insistence that Ethan was independent and likely safe, all of it suddenly reframed. Those small acts of concern, once comforting, now looked strategic, calculated, intentional. The detective continued mapping the morning of March 12th, minute by minute, using the reconstructed timeline. 7:30 a.m., Ethan leaves home. 7:35 to 7:45 a.m., passes Dorothy's window. 7:45 to 7:50 a.m., disappears from public view. 7:50 to 8:15 a.m., window of vanishing. The timeline was tight, unforgiving. Whoever intervened had to be nearby, have knowledge of Ethan's routine, and move quickly. Reynolds checked every box. The town of Hutchinson had assumed innocence because of familiarity, because comfort disguised danger, because the first narrative had been repeated so often it became truth. But truth does not care about comfort. As investigators examined traffic pattern surveillance and Reynolds' own statements over years, a clearer picture emerged. The subtle inconsistencies, the minor exaggerations, the careful positioning near key locations, they were not random. They were deliberate. By now, the detective was no longer treating the investigation as a review. It was an active reconstruction. Every step Ethan might have taken, every chance for interception, was being examined with modern forensic precision. And slowly, like a shadow moving across a sunlit floor, the shape of what had happened that morning began to appear. A trusted figure, a calculated disappearance, a window of opportunity exploited in broad daylight. Hutchinson, in 2009, had believed in normalcy. They had wanted to believe in it. By 2018, the evidence demanded otherwise. The realization was chilling. Not only had a teenager vanished under watchful eyes, but the person closest to that narrative, the one everyone considered safe, may have been the orchestrator. It was a thought almost impossible to process. And yet, the fragments of plastic, the untouched toast, the shifting statements, all of it converged toward the same conclusion. Someone had betrayed the entire community, and the clock was still ticking. The tools available to investigators in 2009 were limited. Paper files, handwritten statements, basic fingerprinting. Even the dog-scent trail, promising as it seemed, was dependent on human interpretation. By 2018, however, technology had transformed the possibilities. DNA analysis had advanced. Surveillance footage was clearer and easier to access, and digital reconstruction could recreate timelines with remarkable precision. The detective seized every advantage. The first breakthrough came in the lab. The blue lunch container fragment, a seemingly innocuous scrap of plastic, underwent touch DNA analysis using techniques unavailable in 2009. The results were definitive. Mark Reynolds' fingerprints were present alongside trace skin cells that could only belong to someone handling the container on the morning Ethan vanished. There was no ambiguity, no could be or likely. This placed Reynolds in physical contact with Ethan's belongings within the critical 7:30 to 7:50 a.m. window. The detective didn't stop there. Traffic cameras, once low resolution and unreliable, were re-examined. License plates were reconstructed using modern image enhancement. Footage from a gas station camera a few blocks away showed Reynolds' vehicle parked unusually early that morning. He was there at a time he had previously denied, far closer to Ethan's path than he had claimed. Small details added up. A neighbor, long dismissed as irrelevant, came forward when the detective presented a new timeline. She had noticed a dark sedan idling near the park's edge around 7:48 a.m. in 2009, a detail she hadn't thought to report before, because she assumed police already knew everything. When combined, these points formed a pattern impossible to ignore. Reynolds' story no longer aligned with the evidence. The narrative of helpfulness and concern collapsed under forensic scrutiny. The detective reconstructed Ethan's final walk using GPS data from the boys' school bus and a combination of street layouts and timing. A clear gap emerged, the 7:45 to 7:50 a.m. period. Reynolds' proximity, the vehicle, and the physical evidence all intersected precisely within this gap. It was no longer a missing child. It was a calculated disappearance executed in a few minutes when no one was watching closely. This is the moment the case shifted. What seemed like a mysterious vanishing, a tragedy without cause, transformed into a scenario with intent, with a perpetrator, and with evidence that could finally lead to justice. The tension in Hutchinson, even 9 years later, was palpable once the detective began to confront Reynolds formally. The man who had once been praised for his concern was now under scrutiny. He denied knowledge, minimized contact, and attempted to explain inconsistencies as memory lapses. But the forensic trail was unrelenting. One overlooked detail became the linchpin, the lunch container. It was symbolic in a way that only a true crime case can achieve. A small, ordinary object, touched, handled, and abandoned, connected a boy's disappearance to a man who had positioned himself as protector. It was both mundane and damning, the perfect evidence for a case that had relied on assumptions for nearly a decade. The detective now had more than circumstantial suspicion. He had fingerprints, location data, witness confirmations, and a reconstructed timeline, all pointing toward Reynolds. The narrative of innocence had been unmasked, yet the investigation remained meticulous. They knew the stakes. A wrong move now could destroy the case, undermine the family's hope, and allow a calculated criminal to evade justice once more. By the end of the week, the detective had prepared a strategy. Surveillance, interviews, and analysis would be used to confront Reynolds with undeniable evidence. Modern technology had bridged the gap that time had tried to obscure. The quiet waiting of the last 9 years was over. The truth, delayed but never destroyed, was finally ready to emerge. By the time detectives scheduled a formal interview with Mark Reynolds, they had built a case that left little room for ambiguity. Every timeline, every piece of evidence, and every witness statement pointed toward him. But evidence alone does not extract truth. Truth often hides in reactions, hesitations, and the spaces between words. Reynolds arrived at the station, calm, composed, a man who had cultivated a decades-long reputation of helpfulness in Hutchinson. He shook hands, smiled politely, and took a seat. To anyone else, he seemed ordinary, almost comforting. To the detective, he was now a puzzle to be solved, a carefully constructed facade that had concealed a brutal reality. The interview began routinely. Reynolds recounted the events of March 12, 2009. He repeated the timeline he had given 9 years ago, insisting he had seen Ethan near the service road and that everything seemed normal. The detective listened silently, noting the microexpressions, the subtle shifts in posture. Then, carefully, the questions became more precise. "Mark, where exactly was your vehicle at 7:38 a.m.? His answer shifted. I believe I was coming down Plum Street. Could have been a bit earlier or later." The detective presented the traffic footage. Reynolds paused. His face tightened, the first visible crack. I didn't remember exactly, he said, voice controlled but faltering. Next, the lunch container fragment. The detective described the lab results, the fingerprints, the DNA traces, the timing. Reynolds' composure wavered slightly, a hand rubbing the edge of the table. "You were in contact with Ethan's belongings that morning," the detective said. "Explain that." There was silence, long, heavy. Reynolds' eyes darted briefly, seeking escape, but the room offered none. Then he leaned back, exhaled slowly, and began to recalibrate his story. Words became measured, careful. Memory lapses, confusion, misunderstanding, but he could not erase the evidence. The reconstructed timeline, the traffic cameras, the witnesses, the DNA, all closed the gaps he had relied on to deflect suspicion. Every attempt to explain away a detail introduced a new contradiction. The psychological pressure mounted. Detectives alternated between periods of silence and pointed questions, letting Reynolds fill the void with explanations that could be tested, dissected, and ultimately disproven. It was a subtle, methodical technique. Patience is a weapon. By the second hour, small cracks widened. Reynolds stumbled over exact times. He contradicted himself on vehicle placement. He even misremembered conversations he had had with other neighbors in 2009, statements already documented in police files. Every inconsistency reinforced the conclusion. This was not a man who had been honest from the beginning. He had inserted himself into the case, presented as a helpful figure, and shaped the narrative to conceal the truth. For the detective, the room was quiet, almost cinematic, a confrontation as much psychological as evidentiary. Reynolds' defenses, built over years, were crumbling under the weight of modern forensic science and meticulous reconstruction. And yet, despite the mounting pressure, he still refused to admit what had truly happened. He offered fragments, half-truths, and evasions. Every answer created new questions, revealing how deliberate his planning had been, how calculated, how he had manipulated time, perception, and trust to achieve his goal. For Hutchinson and for the Parker family, these moments were both devastating and necessary. The comfortable lie, the notion that Ethan had simply vanished, that he might have run away, was finally being shattered. What remained was a terrifying clarity that a trusted member of the community had orchestrated a disappearance and hidden it in plain sight. The detective left the interview room that day knowing one thing: Reynolds was no longer untouchable. The evidence, the timeline, and the inconsistencies converged toward a confrontation that could no longer be avoided. Justice, delayed for nearly a decade, was finally within reach. The investigation shifted from reconstruction to relentless detail work. Detectives no longer relied solely on Reynolds' statements. They sought to map every moment of Ethan Parker's final morning, recreating it with precision that had been impossible in 2009. Every step, every second, became a thread in a tapestry that would expose the truth. The starting point was the neighborhood itself. Plum Street, the red brick house, Dorothy's window, the service road, and Cary Park were all revisited. Using modern GPS mapping, investigators recreated Ethan's walk, the exact distance, average walking pace, and potential points of interception. They overlaid traffic patterns, surveillance footage, and known positions of witnesses. The 45 minutes between leaving his home and being marked absent at school were no longer an amorphous gap. They were a corridor of opportunity, and someone had exploited it. Evidence previously dismissed was now re-examined. The lunch container fragment, fingerprints, and DNA were cross-referenced with Reynolds' known movements and vehicle sightings. The dog's lost scent trail was revisited using modern tracking analysis, revealing subtle deviations in the pattern that aligned with Reynolds' proximity. Investigators also re-interviewed neighbors and classmates. With the passage of years, memories had softened, but the detective's careful prompting elicited new details. One neighbor remembered a dark sedan parked near Cary Park that morning, unremarkable at the time, now significant in light of the forensic evidence. Another recalled seeing Reynolds' car idle in a position inconsistent with his original statements. Small details, once trivial, now aligned like pieces of a puzzle. Each piece reinforced a troubling conclusion. Reynolds had been in the right place at the right time, controlling the environment around Ethan. The disappearance was no accident, no fleeting misjudgment, no spontaneous decision by a teenager. It had been deliberate, calculated, and executed in a narrow, precise window. Investigators then looked at patterns beyond that morning. Reynolds' presence in the community was examined in retrospect. He had been unusually involved with local youth, present at key events, and visible near places Ethan frequented. While all of this seemed benign for years, it now appeared purposeful, a subtle positioning that facilitated control over the situation, minimizing the risk of outside observation. Even the small, haunting details, the untouched toast, the untouched bike, the unclaimed savings, gained clarity. Each ordinary object reinforced the fact that Ethan had not left willingly. He had been interrupted mid-routine, snatched from the mundane security of home and daily life. Investigators now faced the sobering task of translating this reconstructed morning into actionable evidence. Witness statements corroborated with physical proof created a timeline that left little ambiguity. They could identify not only where Ethan had been, but who had influenced each moment of his disappearance. The community's trusted figure, Reynolds, was now fully implicated, not just by suspicion, but by a trail of evidence spanning nearly a decade. His earlier helpfulness, his friendly demeanor, and his insistence on shaping the narrative were all revealed as methods of misdirection. In these painstaking reconstructions, the investigation was no longer just about finding Ethan. It was about exposing how easily trust could be weaponized, how a person could manipulate a town's perception, and how ordinary routines could be exploited with chilling precision. The final moments of March 12th, once shrouded in mystery, were now a sequence of deliberate actions. Every witness, every step, every object, even the smallest fragment of plastic, became part of the undeniable story of betrayal. The morning that had seemed random, impossible, and cruel was now illuminated with terrifying clarity. Hutchinson's peace of mind, long suspended in uncertainty, was about to collide with the truth, and the betrayal, so subtle, so meticulously hidden, would shock a community that had trusted a man for years. The atmosphere in the interrogation room was tense but controlled. Reynolds sat across from the detective, still calm on the surface, but now every glance, every twitch, and every pause was a potential revelation. The evidence was no longer abstract. It was tangible, undeniable, and converging from multiple sources. Fingerprints, DNA, traffic footage, witness statements, and a meticulously reconstructed timeline. The detective began systematically presenting the evidence, piece by piece. First, the lunch container. Reynolds had claimed to have never touched Ethan's belongings, but the DNA on the fragment contradicted him. The detective slid the lab report across the table, fingers lightly tapping the paper. Reynolds' eyes flickered. He cleared his throat, a small crack in his composure. That could have been from handling it months later, he said, voice measured but uncertain. Next, the traffic and surveillance analysis. The footage placed Reynolds' vehicle in locations he had denied. Precise timestamps aligned with the critical 7:45 to 7:50 a.m. window when Ethan vanished. The detective emphasized the improbability. You had less than 5 minutes to intercept Ethan and return to your vehicle unnoticed. But all evidence shows you were present. Reynolds shifted in his seat. He was no longer the calm, helpful figure the town had known. Small beads of sweat appeared along his hairline. His carefully constructed narrative was cracking under the weight of incontrovertible evidence. Witness statements were next. Neighbors and schoolmates had corroborated the presence of a dark sedan, and the timing of Reynolds' movements no longer aligned with his original accounts. Even minor details, like the positioning of the car near the park and the route he allegedly took, revealed deliberate manipulation. Every memory lapse he offered was contradicted by data. The detective paused before presenting the most damning piece, the reconstructed morning itself. Using GPS data, timestamps, and witness accounts, they laid out the exact steps Ethan had taken from his home to the service road, the short corridor in which the disappearance occurred. Reynolds' vehicle and physical presence intersected with Ethan's route at the crucial moment. For the first time, Reynolds did not immediately respond. He blinked rapidly, his mind recalculating. This was a scenario he could not talk his way out of. The facade of helpfulness and trustworthiness that had lasted nearly a decade was dissolving. Detectives did not need confessions yet. They needed to observe reactions. The subtle shifts, the fidgeting, the avoidance of eye contact, all indicated guilt. Every answer Reynolds gave now created more questions, more contradictions. His careful manipulation of the narrative was unraveling. The detective leaned forward, voice steady but firm. Mark, the evidence shows you were involved that morning. You had access, opportunity, and knowledge that no one else had. The community trusted you, but the facts do not lie. You need to tell us the truth. The room fell silent. Reynolds' hands tightened into fists on the table. His breathing slowed, deliberate, as if buying time. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then exhaled slowly. For the first time, the realization that his story could not survive the evidence had fully sunk in. Psychological pressure, forensic certainty, and meticulous reconstruction had cornered him. No longer could he hide behind assumptions, memory lapses, or public trust. The narrative that had shaped Hutchinson for nearly a decade was beginning to crumble. At this moment, the investigation was poised on a knife's edge. Reynolds could either continue to lie and risk further consequences, or begin the long path toward revelation, a path that would finally provide answers to a community that had waited 9 years for truth. The room was silent, except for the soft hum of the overhead light. Mark Reynolds sat across from the detective, the weight of nearly a decade pressing on his shoulders. For years, he had cultivated trust, presented himself as helpful, and manipulated the story of Ethan Parker's disappearance. Now, the meticulous reconstruction, the forensic evidence, and the witness accounts had closed in around him, leaving no room for deception. At first, he denied everything. "I don't know what you're implying," he said, voice steady but thin, lacking the confidence that had once disarmed the community. Every lie he uttered now collided with facts he could no longer avoid. The fingerprints on the lunch container, the traffic timestamps, the dog scent trail, the precise timing of Ethan's last known movements, all pointed directly to him. Minutes passed. The detective presented each piece of evidence calmly, deliberately, like placing stones on a scale. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands clenching, unclenching, searching for words that would not come. The weight of the truth pressed harder with each passing moment. Finally, his voice cracked. A whisper first, then louder. Hesitation, pause, and then confession. I didn't mean for it to... I didn't plan it like this," he muttered. The words were fragmented, revealing his internal struggle. For the first time, the story of helpfulness and concern fell apart. The community figure they had trusted, the man who had smiled, waved, and guided them through the initial investigation, was the orchestrator of Ethan's disappearance. He described the morning, in part with faltering honesty, how he had intercepted Ethan on the path to Cary Park, how the lunch container had been handled, discarded, and overlooked. Every detail revealed premeditation, a calculation of timing, and understanding of the routes Ethan would take. The betrayal was clear. Someone who had claimed safety and guidance had instead become the architect of fear and loss. The confession sent ripples through the Parker family. Once it reached them, the relief of knowing the truth collided with the horror of understanding the depth of manipulation. Their son's absence had been deliberate, orchestrated by a man who was behind decades of community trust. The emotional weight was immense. Anger, sorrow, disbelief, and a bitter sense of justice delayed for nearly 10 years. The town of Hutchinson, too, would eventually absorb the shock. For years, they had believed in innocence, in normalcy, in the idea that the disappearance was a tragic accident or a runaway scenario. Now, the narrative had been shattered. Trust had been weaponized. The very person who had seemed protector had instead been the source of profound harm. Yet, confession alone was not enough. The detective knew this. The details provided by Reynolds had to be corroborated. Each movement verified, each claim cross-checked against forensic data and witness testimony. The full story could now be pieced together, the final moments, the sequence of manipulation, the precise actions that had allowed Ethan to vanish in the span of 45 minutes. It was a confession that marked the turning point. The narrative had shifted from uncertainty to clarity. The antagonist, hidden in plain sight for nearly a decade, was finally revealed. And with the revelation came the first real opportunity for justice, restitution, and emotional closure for a family who had lived in limbo for too long. With Reynolds' confession in hand, investigators could finally reconstruct the morning of March 12, 2009, with unprecedented clarity. The small fragment of evidence, once overlooked, now formed a precise map of the boy's final movements and the calculated intervention that had hidden him from view. Ethan left his red brick home at 7:30 a.m., backpack slung over one shoulder, his breakfast toast still untouched. He followed his usual path toward Cary Park, a route he had taken countless times. Dorothy saw him pass at 7:45 a.m., calm and unhurried. At that point, the day appeared ordinary, every movement predictable. But within the next few minutes, the sequence changed dramatically. Reynolds, positioned deliberately near the service road, intercepted Ethan in a moment when no other witnesses were present. The reconstructed timeline, corroborated by traffic cameras, GPS mapping, and witness verification, showed how Reynolds' vehicle was nearby, allowing him to approach Ethan without raising alarm. The lunch container fragment, a detail that had haunted investigators for years, became pivotal. It revealed not only contact between Reynolds and Ethan's belongings, but also the calculated care with which he managed evidence. Each object Ethan left behind, from the untouched toast to the savings jar, had been left deliberately to suggest a voluntary disappearance. The misdirection was meticulous, designed to exploit assumptions about teenage behavior and community trust. Investigators pieced together the exact window of less than 15 minutes during which Ethan was intercepted. The speed and precision required were extraordinary, highlighting how someone familiar with the boys' routines could manipulate the environment to their advantage. Reynolds' knowledge of the neighborhood, combined with his social standing and assumed trustworthiness, allowed him to operate with near invisibility. Each step was verified. Reynolds' route to the vehicle, the timing of his presence at key points, and the absence of witnesses during the critical moments all aligned. The dog's lost scent trail, once a frustrating anomaly, now perfectly matched the reconstructed sequence, confirming the narrow corridor in which Ethan's disappearance occurred. This reconstruction also explained the gaps and inconsistencies in witness statements. Observers had seen shadows of movement, fleeting images of a dark sedan, or Ethan walking along the familiar path. None had perceived the intervention for what it truly was. The ordinary perception of an ordinary morning had been manipulated with subtlety and precision. The clarity of this reconstruction transformed the case. What had once seemed like a mysterious, almost supernatural vanishing now became a logical, horrifyingly deliberate sequence. Each fact, each object, each second contributed to an incontrovertible narrative. Ethan Parker's disappearance had been planned, executed, and concealed by someone the community had trusted implicitly. The evidence now provided the legal foundation necessary to move toward prosecution. Reynolds' confession, combined with forensic data and reconstructed timelines, allowed investigators to present a comprehensive, fact-based account of the morning. The previously abstract questions of where and how were now answered. What remained was proving the sequence in court and delivering justice. For the Parker family, the reconstruction offered more than just evidence. It provided clarity, finally answering questions that had haunted them for years. Every detail that seemed meaningless, the toast, the backpack, the lunch container, now made sense within the orchestrated plan. The deliberate nature of Ethan's disappearance, once hidden, was fully exposed. And for Hutchinson, the morning of March 12th would never again be perceived as ordinary. The events, once dismissed as an unfortunate anomaly, now stood as a chilling lesson in the consequences of misplaced trust and the meticulous planning of a betrayal hidden in plain sight.